My grandfather was an exceptional man. Born in crushing poverty, he took to a life of crime in his teenage years before straightening up and joining the United States Armed Forces, where he served with distinction. After his service, he won multiple national-level gold medals in wrestling and subsequently completed his education and started a successful trucking company. He had lived such an extraordinary life, he spent his old age just reliving his memories with friends and family through his great storytelling skills. Us grandkids just loved to sit around him as he regaled us with tales from his well-lived life. He always seemed so joyful when he did it, too. But there was this one story that he avoided telling any of us until he was almost on his deathbed. One story that has stayed with me even after all these years. I remember it all like it just happened yesterday. How his eyes widened and his bony hands trembled in fear as he recounted the most frightening experience of his life. Thankfully, I had a tape recorder close at hand, and I can tell you what he told me in his exact words. "Are you sure you want to record this? Because it's not very pleasant." "Okay then, just don't tell your mother what I tell you here. I don't want to be held responsible for any nightmares you might end up having because of this." So, all this happened back in 1942 in the midst of the Pacific Theater. The Japanese had pushed all the way through the Solomon Islands. The campaign was one of the first offensive pushes by the Allied Army to push the Japs back. And let me tell you, it was a spectacular failure at first. We were not prepared for the attack. Remember, this was early in the war, and command was still figuring out how to operate in this new hell, and they had no idea what the fuck they were doing. They had little to no experience fighting in the muggy jungles. Our transport infrastructure, our supply lines, were pathetically weak. The Japanese, on the other hand, were well fortified and carried out ambushes on a regular basis. It wasn't surprising to have entire patrol squads get wiped out in the blink of an eye. The attackers would suddenly appear out of the shadows and disappear before help could arrive. It was terrible. We were on edge all the time. Every branch that snapped, every leaf that rustled got our fingers pushing against the trigger of our rifles. Compounding all that were the harsh conditions. We were more likely to be killed by disease than war. The food we ate was barely enough to keep us on our feet. The threat of malaria and dysentery always loomed large. Snakes, spiders, and other insects larger than anything we'd ever seen crawled on our emaciated bodies as we slept. Swarms of flies that looked like dark little clouds descended on the corpses of our brothers. It was hell. We were permanently covered in layers of dirt. Rains lashed the forest at an alarming frequency, turning the weather so humid it felt like our skin was starting to melt. The repeated spells of rain pretty much destroyed our communication lines, and the ground had turned so boggy that some soldiers had gotten stuck in them, right up to their thighs. It was so bad that at times command structure had completely broken down, and disorganized chunks of the army were operating almost independently from each other. It was in such a situation that nightmare appeared in our lives. One of the worst aspects of fighting in the jungle was the psychological warfare. The Japs would kidnap our soldiers, torture them for information, brutalize them beyond what should be humanly acceptable, and sent them back, barely clinging to life. We could never save them, and I think that was the point, to watch our comrades, our brothers in arms, waste away in front of us while our meager medical supplies could do nothing to help them. But that wasn't the worst of it. You see, one thing they delighted in doing was using our soldiers as bait to draw the rest of us out. They would torture our soldiers to the brink of death and tie them up to a tree, usually in a clearing, and hide in the forest. If we went out to help, they would pick us off from the trees. All we could do was just stay hidden and listen to the agony-filled death throes of our fellow soldiers. Wait till the last drop of life was slowly squeezed out of them as they cried out for their mothers.
It was one such incident that changed everything, or at least an incident that looked deceptively like the nightmare that we had gotten used to. Captain Miller, a hard-nosed veteran who was in charge of us, he was the one who sent us out on patrol that day. There were about a dozen of us cutting our way through the jungle when we heard the screams. You see, in forests, it's actually quite hard to track down the source of a loud noise like that. If someone screams, it feels like it's coming from everywhere, like the woods are echoing the sound and speaking to you themselves. But not this time. Instinctively, almost on a primal level, we knew where the screams were coming from, and almost as if in a daze, we gripped our guns tight in our hands and followed, or more likely, we were led there, if that makes any sense. It didn't take us long to find the man who was screaming. He was dressed in U.S. Army fatigues, or at least the trousers. His shirt was torn and hanging from his shoulders. He was, God, this is hard. He was tied to a tree and had his hands on his stomach, trying to push down his intestines that were spilling out like thick little bloody ropes. And his screams, it's like I can still hear them, like they're still making my ears ring. The pain in those screams, I could feel it in my bones. I began walking towards him before I even realized what I was doing. I felt a hand on my shoulder and was pulled back forcefully. I looked into the eyes of the man who pulled me back. They were wide open, alarmed, like he knew something was seriously wrong here. He shook his head slowly, warning me not to go ahead, even as that man continued to scream. I gulped and nodded. We spread out into the woods with our guns drawn, keeping each other in sight to brace ourselves for the Jap ambush. I winced as twigs snapped under my boots. I realized I was afraid, not of the Japanese, presumably hiding in the trees somewhere close to us. No, but the wounded man in front of us. It was so bizarre. I can't explain it, but I felt it, deep in my soul. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run away, to keep running until I left this man far behind me. I took up position slightly to the man's left and began waiting for him to die and for it, whatever it was, to end. But it didn't. The man screamed. He cried. He sobbed. He called for help, but he just didn't seem to die. Minutes turned into hours, and the sun began dipping beneath the horizon, but he kept screaming. We stood rooted to our spots, unable to move, as if mesmerized by the strange performance. The moon climbed up into the sky, and the man's blood began gleaming under the white light that beamed down on him, but he still didn't die. My legs were aching, my neck was stiff, and I could hear someone to my right crying softly in terror. It was like we knew that it was not that man, but we who were about to die. And then it happened. The man stopped crying. Then the world was plunged into silence, and I do mean complete silence. We couldn't hear anything. No birds, no crickets, no leaves rustling in the wind. We couldn't even hear ourselves breathing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then the man got up. He easily tore off the rope holding him in place and jumped up on his feet. His intestines hung limply from his belly, which looked like someone had punched a hole through it. Fuck! Half his gut was gone, just straight gone. I could see straight through it. No man can live through an injury like that, let alone be completely fine like he seemed to be. You see how scared I am right now? Do you see how my hands are trembling, even after all these years, just by thinking about that night? So you can imagine just how terrified I was when that man glared at me. His eyes shot up to mine, like he knew where I was, like he'd always known where I was.
There was such malice in his eyes, I almost passed out from the fear. And then he screeched. It was loud and shrill, like thousands of babies screaming into our ears. I remember quaking in my boots just looking at that hateful snarl on his face.
He began running towards me, with these big, loping strides covering half the distance within seconds. Thankfully, that sudden burst of motion had restored my senses, and I started running away from him. I dropped my gun, my backpack, and just bolted. I leapt over small rocks and overgrown roots, ducked under branches, waded through thickets, stumbled in the dark, but kept on running. My boots at one point got stuck in the soggy mud, but I pulled myself free and pumped my legs to keep running. I stole a glance over my shoulder and saw him gaining on me, intestines slapping against his thigh as he ran. He was smiling, ear to ear, like the chase was the best thing to have ever happened to him, like he wanted to take his time and truly savor the hunt. Move, move, move! Must go faster, I thought. I heard screams behind me, accompanied by loud tearing and squelching sounds. He was ripping the patrol squad apart, one by one, and soon it was going to be my turn. My lungs were on fire, each breath a desperate act of survival. My legs were starting to wobble. I knew I would not last. I couldn't outrun him, but I could hide. I found this small crevice where this giant tree had been uprooted, tucked away in a dark corner of the woods. I scrambled for the tiny hole and cloaked myself in the shadows. I wasn't even thinking about snakes or some other venomous creature waiting for me in the dark. I just wanted to get the fuck away from that thing. I pulled my knees close to my chest, felt my heart hammering against my sternum, and waited for that thing to find me and put an end to it all. I heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate, felt the leaves shift and crunch underneath his bare feet. Then he began whistling. It was oddly melodious, like a bird singing an ode to the forest. I heard the fallen tree creak as he stepped on it and glided towards me. Dark drops of blood came crashing down on the ground inches from my feet. He called for me in my mother's voice. She had been dead for over 5 years by that point. Gently, with love, he called for me and laughed when I didn't move. I put my hands on my helmet, pulled it down in front of my eyes, and began crying as silently as I could. It was over. I knew I was going to die. But for some odd reason, he didn't kill me. Maybe it's because he wanted to leave one survivor alive to go out and talk about him, spread the terror he had inflicted on our patrol squad. I don't know. I don't even know when he left. I spent the whole night there, alone, shivering in that little hole. Even when the sun had come up and bathed the forest floor with light, I still refused to come out, such was the extent of my fear. It wasn't until another patrol came across me that I felt safe enough to come out. They had to carry me back on a stretcher. I was delirious with fear, and every muscle in my body was exhausted, but I was alive. That was the closest I came to that thing, but that wasn't my only encounter with it. All throughout my stay there, I heard stories about it. From my own regiment and others, hell, even the Japs had supposedly run across it. This immortal thing that imitated voices, pretended to be wounded and tore apart entire squads at a time. Or how he came to you at night when you were sleeping, whispering utter hatred into your ears before dragging you away and slicing you to pieces. Some patrol squads discovered remains of corpses in odd places, like decapitated heads on top of trees or limbs splayed out in strange patterns near the base camp. At one point, we feared we were losing more men to that thing than to the Japanese. I'm sure they felt the same.
All the horrors that I witnessed in that country, the air bombings, the disease, the burnt corpses, were all nothing compared to that night. I remember how relieved I felt when we finally marched out of that green hell. Even with all the guns and artillery going off around me, all I could think of was that I was glad I was out of that damned forest.
My grandpa was an American infantryman in the Second World War. He was only about 19 years old when he enlisted. He thought the military would be his ticket to see the world, maybe the shores of Normandy or the Pacific Islands. Instead, he ended up stationed far closer to home in the rugged terrain of northern Norway. Here is some necessary historical context. During World War II, Norway was occupied by Nazi Germany, but the mountainous regions near the Swedish border were often areas of intense, quiet conflict. The Norwegian resistance, supported by Allied forces, frequently used the harsh landscape to their advantage. To avoid drawing too much attention and inciting full-scale battles in vulnerable areas, Allied troops were sometimes ordered to fall back and hold positions in remote, high-altitude villages. That is how my grandpa found himself stationed in an isolated village nestled in the Scandinavian mountains. It was early in the winter of 1943. My grandpa's company was stationed in a secluded village of about 500 people. The location's primary advantage was its inaccessibility, making a spontaneous Nazi invasion highly unlikely. The disadvantage, however, was that communication with other Allied forces was incredibly difficult. The situation worsened in early December when a series of severe blizzards swept through the region, completely wiping out the few communication lines they possessed. Effectively trapped in this isolated Norwegian village without the ability to contact their superiors, my grandpa's captain decided the best course of action was to maintain their standing orders and defend the village. Weeks turned into a blur. The roads leading to the outside world were buried under 7 to 9 feet of dense snow, rendering any attempts to travel or communication futile. As winter deepened, the landscape became stark. The trees, stripped of their leaves, looked like broken ribs protruding from the mountainside. The village was situated deep in a valley between towering peaks, meaning sunlight only reached them for a few fleeting hours each day, creating a persistent atmosphere of perpetual dusk. One night, my grandpa was at the local tavern with a few friends from his company. A group of villagers approached them, one man looking particularly frantic. The villagers spoke in Norwegian, and none of them were accustomed to having Americans around. The frantic man began shouting in broken English, "Where take you the children?" Fortunately, one of the soldiers my grandpa was drinking with spoke fluent Norwegian and stepped in as an impromptu translator. After several minutes of chaotic shouting and confusion, the translator turned to my grandpa and the others and said, "They say some of the village children have gone missing. They want us to do something about it." Obviously, the American military doesn't function as local law enforcement, so my grandpa and his friends advised the villagers to come back to the headquarters, which was just a makeshift barracks set up in the church, to speak directly with the captain. Due to the language barrier, the meeting with the captain took about 2 hours. Through the translator, they managed to piece together the situation. A few weeks after the company had arrived, the locals started noticing bizarre incidents. Initially, it was just minor things disappearing, pieces of wood and tarp from sheds. But over the next 2 months, valuable items began vanishing from homes. One man claimed that a family heirloom, a traditional handcrafted hunting knife, had been stolen from his fireplace mantel. These strange thefts culminated in the terrifying disappearance of a village child. Many initially assumed the child's disappearance was a tragic accident. Perhaps he fell into a snowdrift or was attacked by a wolf or other predatory animal. But it wasn't just one child. Several had vanished.
The frantic man who had approached them in the tavern? He was the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing just 2 days prior. He had searched everywhere, even organizing a search party with the other villagers, but they couldn't find a single trace of the children. The captain assured the villagers he would investigate and promised to send his men on nightly patrols to catch whoever or whatever was responsible for the thefts and abductions. Later that same night, Private Miller disappeared from the barracks. Children going missing was one thing, but a fully grown soldier? It seemed highly unlikely that an animal could take down a healthy, armed man without a struggle. Naturally, rumors started circulating about a monster living in the mountains, coming down at night to prey on the village. Despite the captain's nightly patrols, the disappearances continued. Miller remained the only adult victim. The rest were all young children between the ages of 5 and 10. In total, including the first 3, 7 children had vanished from the town. Suspicion began to grow within the company. Some theorized that the impoverished villagers were selling their children to human traffickers for money. However, this theory fell apart when they remembered the roads were still completely blocked by snow. 3 more weeks passed without any further incidents. By this point, it was early spring, and the snow was beginning to thaw. It was during this time, while my grandpa was on patrol with several other soldiers, that they finally discovered the horrifying truth behind the disappearances. It was past midnight when my grandpa and his comrades spotted a figure peering through the window of a villager's house. Being at the opposite end of the street, the figure didn't immediately notice the patrol. When my grandpa and the other soldiers yelled, the figure tore itself away from the window and bolted. Convinced they had finally found the culprit, the patrol gave chase. They ran through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, screaming at the figure to stop. The pursuit led them to the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still quite deep. The figure seemed to jump into the ground, vanishing into thin air. As the patrol closed in, they realized the prowler had leapt into a cave hollowed out of a massive snowdrift. Just as the soldiers started shouting into the cave, demanding the figure surrender, several gunshots erupted from the entrance. Reacting instinctively, my grandpa and the rest of the patrol raised their weapons and fired into the hole. Then, silence. They waited for what felt like hours, although it was only a few minutes. One brave soldier volunteered to investigate. Drawing his pistol, he knelt and crawled into the cave. A few seconds later, he emerged, his face a mask of absolute horror. My grandpa pulled out his flashlight and shone it into the cave, revealing the gruesome explanation for the town's nightmare. The figure they had been chasing was Private Miller, the soldier who had gone missing weeks earlier. They had shot him right through the heart. But Miller wasn't alone in the cave. Alongside his body were the remains of 7 partially eaten children. Whether it was the stress of being snowed in, the oppressive darkness, or a pre-existing terrible mental illness, Miller had completely lost his mind. He had been breaking into the villagers' homes, snatching their children in the dead of night. He had used the missing hunting knife to dismember the bodies after slitting their throats, hiding them in the macabre snow cave he had built on the edge of town.
Happy Veterans Day to all my brothers and sisters in arms, and thanks to everyone else for making us feel like we accomplished something during our service. Anyway, like the title says, I was in the military for 10 years. During that time, I traveled all over the world for deployments and training ops. I've seen a lot of the bad shit the world has to offer, and a lot of the good. I was an infantryman and sniper, and during my first deployment to Zarkhan, I spent a lot of time sitting on rooftops or inside abandoned buildings. I would watch streets, city blocks, whatever, trying to pin down patterns of life and get a better idea of what was happening out in sector. Often, my 3-man team would get attached to a line platoon and go out on a 48-hour mission to get eyes on an intersection or building where we suspected the enemy moved. 99.9% of the time, everything went according to plan. We would either spend all day looking at nothing, we would get compromised at the break of dawn and get into a day-long gunfight, or if we were really lucky, we would get the drop on the bad guys and end up ambushing them. A couple times, though, things would happen that really defied logic or expectation. Now understand that throughout this whole period of my life, I was almost always sleep-deprived, hungry, and under extreme levels of stress. I don't discount the idea that at least some of what I experienced was due to the above factors playing tricks on my mind or whatever. Oh, also, I've had 1 or 2 paranormal experiences from before the military. Don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but worth mentioning. Al-Qadar. We were on a foot patrol to check out a part of our sector we rarely went to. Not for any specific reason. The bad guys never went there, so we never went there. The whole area, about 3 city blocks, had been a minority enclave before the fall of General Zaid, but after law and order broke down completely, those minorities were either forced out or murdered. We were just going from house to house at night checking things out. We found this one house with a room on the roof that had been built separately from the main structure, which in and of itself was pretty common. What was strange was that this room had a door that was locked from the inside. It was a sheet metal door with a hand latch on the inside, which you could lock with a padlock. For some reason, this intrigued me, and I had an urge to find out what was in there. So we proceed to go to town on this fucking door with our breaching kit. It took about 20 minutes of solid work before we yanked this fucking door open. First off, at this point, I'm a seasoned combat soldier, seen some shit, did some shit, not easily spooked. This room scared the fuck out of me as soon as we opened the door. There was a single hallway leading back to a T intersection. It was pitch black, and the smell wafting out of there was like a butcher shop. Blood, raw meat, etc. My hackles are at attention at this point. We enter slowly and spread out to check the structure. There were several rooms, all with dried blood covering the floor, smears on the walls. It was evident some horrific shit happened in here. The last room contained an old metal bed frame with leather restraints and wires running off to the opposite corner where a car battery sat. Also, there was an oppressive heaviness in the whole place, like the air had weight. We got the fuck out of there as quickly as we could. The strangest part was that it was locked with a padlock and deadbolted from the inside, but there was absolutely no other way out beside the door. No windows, one door, locked from the inside. We never figured that one out, but I still think about it all the time. That same night, we found another house locked from the inside. Bullet holes all over the walls and "Please God help us" written over and over on the wall in the local dialect. The words were written in red ink, and I swear to God, one of the words was dripping wet red down the wall. Our interpreter said it was a bad place, and we noped the fuck back to the cop as quickly as possible. Around the fall of 2008, we were back from Zarkand and trying to settle back into the garrison mindset, dial things back a notch, as it were. Everyone was waiting to go on block leave for 30 days and come back ready for round 2. It was during that time I got promoted to sergeant and put in charge of my first fire team. Part of every new NCO's duties is to provide the beer for a platoon-wide NCOPD, or Non-Commissioned Officer Professional Development class, basically an excuse for all the sergeants to get blasted together and swap stories, share advice, etc. One of the senior guys in my company, Sergeant First Class Vance, had been in the military for quite a while. He'd been to the Kestrel conflict, the Vandanian War, and Operation Dune Spear before our recent deployments.
He told me about waiting on the Oasian side of the berm, waiting to go into Zarhan. stealth fighters and bombers flying by overhead to knock out Zarhani army positions, the roar of artillery loosing their missiles against unsuspecting armor and infantry miles away. They waited in that desert for 6 months before finally crossing into Tariq. By the time they got there, the war was pretty much over. He was with an armored cavalry unit and saw some limited action, mainly against poorly trained and equipped conscript units and ancient surplus tanks. The coalition war machine swept over those poorly defended positions easily, and within 72 hours, the ground war was over. Now, I know everyone has seen famous war documentaries and seen the news footage of the Highway of Death. My buddy Vance wasn't involved in that part of the ground action. His unit was part of the Anvil, the retreating Zarhani forces fed during their flight from Tariq. After everything was said and done, they still spent the next few months on the ground, basically cleaning everything up. He told me stories about clearing Zarhani bunkers and trench complexes, sifting through the remains of entire companies wiped out in bombing or whatever. Up to this point, what he described was pretty typical of a major ground action, but I still can't imagine finding myself in the position of being in a major conventional war. He went on to describe one day in particular toward the end of his time on the ground. They woke up from their hastily dug fighting positions in the middle of the desert, wiped the grime out of their eyes, ate a quick MRE, and trucked to a destroyed Zarhani radar site. His platoon was tasked with collecting any intelligence they might find and collecting dog tags off the corpses that littered what seemed to be the entire Tariqi desert. They still had to be careful. A handful of guys had already been killed by booby traps that the Zarhanis strung up before retreating. They arrived on site and started their sweep. There were dozens of charred corpses scattered around outside. The site was a relatively deep and well-constructed bunker that contained the CP and a trench line about 100 meters long. Strewn about were pictures of wives and kids, personal effects, letters, books. Anything that hadn't been destroyed in the bombing was collected by the troops as war trophies or brought back to S2 for analysis. He found himself alone down in the bunker. It was a rectangular concrete box with a machine gun slit in the front. Think classic war movies. The roof was half collapsed with a large hole punched through it where a bunker buster had burrowed down and incinerated the occupants. There was a dead enemy soldier slumped across a heavy machine gun. He said even then he got a really creepy vibe down there. Aside from the dead machine gunner, there were the remains of at least 3 others in there, but they were closer to being completely atomized. They must have been directly under the bomb when it fell. My buddy Vance quickly snatched the machine gunner's dog tags off his neck, stuffed them in his pocket, and left, back to the surface. Later on, the platoon was gathered together eating lunch in the scorched sand. He described it like those war films where every time he took a step, it left a footprint of white sand in the blackened top layer. Anyway, the guys were comparing stories about what they'd seen and what trophies they had collected. They got down to the dog tags they had and started comparing the number they had managed to collect. Some guys had a pile of tags, others only a few. Vance had the one set he found on the machine gunner. He went on to tell some friends about how creepy it had been in the bunker and how he felt kind of bad for that gunner, manning his position to the last, maybe covering his buddy's retreat in the face of the coalition forces. One of his friends asked, "What machine gunner?" He had been down in the bunker and hadn't seen any bodies down there. Thinking his friend was mistaken, maybe there was a different bunker he hadn't seen, he went back after lunch to make sure. He stepped down into the bunker, and sure enough, there was the heavy machine gun with no gunner. He said at this point his hair was standing on end. He was sure the dead guy had been there. That's when he noticed the drag marks through the charred topsoil. They led across the floor and up the steps to the surface. He followed them out away from the fighting position about 50 meters. Lying in the sand was the gunner. His body was frozen in a low crawl position, left leg straight back, right knee cocked up, left arm reaching forward and raised off the ground as if reaching for something, maybe a way home. He assumed one of the sick fucks in his platoon had moved the body, but when he asked, no one fessed up. On the drive back, he realized the machine gunner was facing towards the Zarhani border.